Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Stephen Hinshaw will present ADHD Controversy, Key Research Findings, Rising Prevalence, and Promise. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation funds the most innovative ideas in neuroscience and psychiatry to better understand the causes and develop new ways to treat brain and behavior disorders. These disorders include addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, and schizophrenia. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $418 million to fund more than 6,000 grants around the world. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Stephen Hinshaw. Dr. Hinshaw is Professor of Psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and Professor of Psychiatry and Vice Chair for Child and Adolescent Psychology at the University of California, San Francisco. He was the 2019 Ruane Prize winner for Outstanding Achievement in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Research. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Hinshaw's presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as is possible in the time allotted. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Hinshaw. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And it's a delight to be here. And I am trying to get my slides unstuck. This is always the most difficult part of any webinar. And
if you can maybe escape maybe, and let's try to put it again from the start.
Let's see. Yeah, I'm not quite getting escape to escape.
Okay.
Let's see if I can just go back to the beginning. I think that's probably the best way we'll do it.
There we go.
So in reverse order, I hope that the audience is paying close attention because there will be a quiz. Working memory. All right, so here's the title. Thanks for the introduction, and let's get going. So for those of you in the audience who are scientists or parents or advocates or clinicians, teachers, how many times have you heard over the last decades, everybody's got an ADHD diagnosis? If only our schools were better, only if parents were a bit less permissive. These medications, they're mind control, they're poisons. So many myths abound about ADHD. And the purpose of today's webinar is to retract those myths and let the light of science shine on this very important topic. Another myth is it's all in the genes. There's nothing a kid or family can do. It's all in context. It's all schools, as I said before. It's really the combination of the two that's the main theme for today. It's not surprising that when schools and productivity at work and kids and misbehavior and so-called mind control medications are part of the topic area, controversy would abound. So I'm going to start the presentation maybe in a kind of unusual fashion by showing you three advertisements that have been out in the last 20 years for medicines for ADHD. Now, I don't work for or consult with pharma. I'm not trying to sell any medicines. There's a doctrine called fair use, whereby a scholar can show in a book or in a presentation these ads, not again for the purpose of selling anything, but to comment on the messages these advertisements might give. Now, intriguingly, in 1997 and again in 1999, the Food and Drug Administration essentially allowed these ads to occur in the United States. We joined New Zealand as the only other country on earth allowing direct-to-consumer ads. Controversial. Is this helpful in reducing stigma? Is it good for prices, or is it help price fixing? Nonetheless, these are ads that have appeared in Ladies' Home Journal, TV Guide, these kinds of outlets. So here's an ad for Concerta in the early 2000s. Concerta is methylphenidate, trade name Ritalin, in a formulation that distributes it in one dose that lasts 10 to 12 hours. And we see the stereotype of ADHD here, white middle class youngster with his white middle class mother. And I'm not going to read the whole ad, but basically the message is, when I give my son Jason his ADHD medicine, I see him, the real boy, not these annoying symptoms. In fact, the implicit message is that medicating people for ADHD removes the stigma. It allows one to see the real person in there, not just bothersome symptoms. Very powerful message, whether true or not, and we'll comment on treatment later in the webinar. Now we move a few years ahead for an advertisement for Adderall XR, extended release. And clearly the target in this ad is not kids, but adults with ADHD. And if you've got good eyes, you can see citations to psychiatric literature that if you have adult ADHD, you're about twice as likely to get divorced as the next adult, and you're about a third as likely to have a diagnosis of major depression. Now, it's completely unclear what drives what. Do depressive symptoms lead to ADHD in some adults or vice versa? Were relationship problems present before the ADHD was diagnosed or not? Nonetheless, again, a very powerful message. And from a little over 10 years ago when this ad appeared, it's very clear at that time and continuing through today, the biggest increase in medication markets is not for kids with ADHD, but adults. More kids are medicated because more kids are getting diagnosed, but on a percentage basis, many more adults with a diagnosis of ADHD, especially women, are getting treated with medicines than before. So in our quick tour, let's go to the third ad. Baseball fans, you'll know this is Shane Victorino, first Hawaiian American to play Major League Baseball, 2 World Series rings. And as part of a campaign by 2 professional groups and 1 pharmaceutical company, Shane came out and said, I didn't outgrow my ADHD. You see the letters are truncated on the right side of the slide, a lot of megs in the slide. That's why I'm telling my story. So this is an anti-stigma campaign that a big, strong, good-looking Major League ball player would come out of the closet about his ADHD. But there's another meaning to this statement. If Shane Victorino or other ball players who have ADHD didn't disclose and get a medical waiver, and they took stimulant medications during games, they'd be thrown out for half the season, 81 games in a regular season, for using a performance-enhancing medication. So you need to get the diagnosis and the waiver in order to use medications in pro sports. Interestingly, about twice as many Major League Baseball players get ADHD exemptions as do basketball or hockey or football players, which is an interesting epidemiologic kind of quandary. Is there really more ADHD in Major League Baseball? Or another hypothesis is that, frankly, baseball may be the most boring sport ever created in the history of sports. Well, sorry, baseball fans, but not quite tongue in cheek. Baseball is a game of a lot of inaction, and then hours later, especially in extra innings, that performance edge, pinch hitting in the 10th inning or seeing that sinking line drive and you're in center field sinking before your eyes, maybe this is part of the controversy, isn't it? Maybe more Major League Baseball players are getting diagnoses to get that performance edge when they really don't have ADHD. So in some ways, these 3 ads, white middle class family, adults with ADHD, ball players, and performance enhancement, give us some sense of how controversial scientifically and clinically the whole topic is. So we're not going to give ADHD 101 and get into all the symptoms and the DSM and the RDoc, but the underlying behavioral constituent patterns are dimensions of A, inattention and disorganization, and B, hyperactive and impulsive behaviors and symptoms. In the DSM, there's 9 of these symptoms in each domain. They can be rated not at all, just a little, pretty much, very much, and you can count up the number of symptoms, and if the symptom levels are high given your age and impairing at home, school, work, relationships, and are not clearly explained by another diagnosis, ADHD may be the diagnostic category in which one is placed. If your symptoms are predominantly in that first group of inattentive disorganized symptoms, you get the diagnosis of the inattentive style or presentation. Exclusively in the hyperactive impulsive domain, you get the diagnosis of ADHD, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, or as with most kids who were referred, you've got a lot of inattention and disorganization and a lot of hyperactivity, impulsivity. Let's say a careful diagnosis is made, and we're going to come back to this point because all too often ADHD diagnoses are given by non-specialists in very cursory ways. But if a diagnosis is given and the person's clearly above threshold, the cost to our economy last year, or probably 2018 with the last real figures, the past year COVID interceded and some of the figures aren't in yet, the cost of not just treating ADHD, but what are so-called the indirect costs, juvenile justice, special ed, substance use problems for teens, was over 100 billion to the economy. And for adults, double that, largely related to employment problems, workers' comp, underemployment, unemployment benefits, etc. So whatever ADHD is in terms of its organizational impairments, inattention, impulsivity, school and work and comorbid issues like substance abuse are quite costly. Second, in childhood, kids with ADHD tend to be disliked by their peers even more than kids with autism spectrum disorders or delinquency or anxiety or depression. There's something about the consistent inconsistency of the behavior patterns that can drive parents to distraction and drive peers to distraction. Kids with ADHD are likely to be the ones not invited back to the birthday party the next year, because at their friend's birthday party, when the mom or dad brought the cake into the room, they blew out the candles out of sheer impulsive excitement before the birthday kid did. And it might seem humorous, but if you're a peer, these are fighting words. And so the consistent inconsistency has a social cost. By and large, family interactions don't cause the symptoms of ADHD. In extreme deprivation, as we'll talk about, inattention, disorganization, hyperactivity, impulsivity can emerge. But families, given the highly biological and genetic nature of ADHD symptoms, inadvertently get caught in reciprocal chains of nagging, scolding, giving in, which can fuel the fire of the underlying biological origins of ADHD. Much research for years, and especially in the last 5 years, and especially out of Scandinavia with these population-wide databases, attests to the fact that ADHD is linked across the lifespan with high risk for accidental injury. And that can be falling, accidents in cars, and the bottom category here, the bottom row, inflicted injury, self-harm, non-suicidal self-injury, and actual suicide attempts have been shown now across many cultures to be far higher in individuals with ADHD than in not. Lowered lifespan has also been documented increasingly by researchers employing formulas to look at what predicts lifespan, and a lot of health indicators are quite low in individuals with ADHD. So despite the myth that this is just a bothersome set of behaviors, ineffective school classrooms, et cetera, the impairments are quite serious. A couple of quick points. A disorder in medicine is a syndrome, co-occurring symptoms with a unified cause. Well, ADHD is a syndrome, but it's not a disorder. As we'll discuss very shortly, ADHD has multiple causal pathways that accrue. And this is true for depression, it's true for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It's not alone. Second, are there really more boys than girls with ADHD? Yes, at about 2.5 to 1, not 10 to 1, as was posited when I was in grad school some years ago. But these sex differences Intriguingly, by the adult years, it's about as many women as men getting diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood. There's some reasons for that we'll talk about. Like all neurodevelopmental conditions in childhood, Tourette's, autism spectrum, early onset conduct disorder, there is a male predominance, but for too many years, ADHD has been essentially overlooked in girls and in women. Remarkably, in any country on our planet that is above a subsistence economy and where there's compulsory education, the child and adolescent prevalence of ADHD is about 5 to 6%. It's remarkably consistent. Makes you think of some genetic differences between people. Then when school starts, these symptoms become salient. However, the United States and Israel currently are about double that world average, and I'll have more to say about cultural forces that might be driving high diagnoses in certain societies a bit later in the talk. So here's our quick tour of what might be going on in the minds and brains and bodies of individuals with ADHD. Well, number one, it's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It must be a disorder of attention. The name changed in 1980 from hyperkinesis or hyperactivity to ADD. Well, where is the attention deficit? This is an intriguing question to a cognitive scientist, because there is not just one entity called attention. Sustained attention. If I talk long enough, the entire audience at their Zoom screens will fall asleep. And the theory is that people with ADHD will get drowsy and unfocused sooner. Or maybe it's selective attention. Not quite lunchtime on the West Coast. Did I hear my stomach growl? Oh, I'm talking to you all. I have to constantly select where my attentional capacities and resources are directed. And maybe that's the deficit with ADHD. Or capacity, how many bits of information, this is sometimes again called working memory, can you hold at once? And there may be deficits there. So ADHD is not a simple deficit in attention. There's many forms of attention. And what about people with ADHD, kids, teens, or adults, who can stay focused on a video game for hour after hour on something they're very interested? So ADHD can incur hyperfocus. And the bottom line is that rather than saying ADHD is an attention deficit disorder, the far more accurate portrayal is ADHD is a disorder of the ability to regulate your attention as situational demands shift, going from rest period to school period, going from study hall to algebra, going from break at work to intensive task focus. It's a regulatory disorder rather than an attention disorder per se. And that leads to number two, this concept of executive functions. Classic neuropsychological tests can measure how well you plan, how well you can kind of back off from the interfering, distracting stimuli around you. Your working memory, another example of attentional capacity, ability to quickly make a mid-course correction on a mistake you've made. Many individuals with ADHD do poorly on these executive function tasks. However, 30 to 40% of ADHD individuals pass these tests pretty readily. And there are executive function theories of depression and bipolar disorder and PTSD. So executive function is not the smoking gun, if you will, to explain all of ADHD. Moving swiftly to our third model, maybe it's not about all these executive functions. There's one in particular, our colleague Russ Berkeley says, called response inhibition. Something's been previously rewarded. It was amazing how good it felt to blow out the birthday candles at your party last month. But now you're at your friend's house, the cake comes in with those melting colorful candles. You have to think for half a second, it's not my birthday, it's hers. And if you have a deficit in such response inhibition, you're unlikely to be able to utilize all the other executive functions that would help you plan the rest of the day. A fourth model has to do with motivation. And I hasten to say that this does not mean that people with ADHD are unmotivated or not trying. We're talking here about intrinsic motivation. We all get extrinsic rewards. We probably wouldn't go to work unless we got paid. But as we get good at tasks, We do it for the joy of doing it and for that good feeling inside. Because of potential dopamine insufficiencies in the brains of many people with ADHD, a prevalent theory is that these individuals are slower to develop such a sense of intrinsic motivation, hence stimulant medications, which temporarily increase the supply of dopamine at the synapse, or behavioral regular reward programs may be needed. And this is an old model from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's been revived lately. Our colleague, the director of NIDA, Nora Volkov, published a study over 10 years ago now showing, with just a brief slide here, through PET scanning, that in the key regions of the brain and pathways in the brain essential for intrinsic motivation, sustained attention, etc., adults with ADHD with no comorbid diagnoses compared to a carefully matched control group had 40% fewer receptors for the neurotransmitter dopamine in those very areas, but not in control regions of the brain, the parietal lobes, for example, that wouldn't be implicated. So one hypothesis is that for at least a subgroup or a subset, ADHD may be a genetically mediated inborn deficit in the ability of dopamine to do its performance functions well in the brain, a strongly psychobiological theory. A little blurry slide here, I got to get a sharper one. All this means in sort of fancy language of developmental psychopathology, there may be for an outcome X like ADHD, in one case, high genetic loading in both parents or both sides of the family tree. In another case, extreme early deprivation. In another case, motivation deficits, but not executive deficits, all leading to what looks like pretty identical cases of ADHD. And then multifinality, as opposed to equifinality, would be that if you've got some of the risk genes for ADHD, you're not doomed to fail in school and in the workplace. Depending on compensatory and protective factors, you might have very productive or less productive outcomes. It's not a simple one-to-one relation between genes and behavior, between environments and behavior. It's a more complex world we live in. Final biological point, the work of Phil Shaw at NIH for going on 15, 20 years has focused on the development of the prefrontal cortex. Cortex, from its Greek origins, meaning bark, think of the bark of a tree, a lot of the trees inside that bark. This is the thin outer layer, the gray matter where the cell bodies are. The white matter transmits nerve conduction through the brain to other parts of the cortex. Typically developing kids reach, after being born with a plethora of neurons and then thinning and pruning, the prefrontal cortex matures, and at the ripe old age of about 6, it reaches its maximum maturity and slowly prunes and thins until the late 20s. However, in a large sample of kids, predominantly boys with ADHD, Shaw and his colleagues found that the maximum or the mean age of the maximum prefrontal cortical thickness was about 3.5 years delayed in the ADHD sample. Now, there's a search is still on for whether this is a direct genetic byproduct, whether there's epigenetic experiential forces that drive this. But in many ways, and fascinatingly, 60, 70 years ago, in the first psychometric studies of the behavior problems we now call ADHD, the scientists back then named inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity, the immaturity syndrome, because these kids acted a few years younger than the age expected. Well, it turns out that half a century after this description, neural research is revealing that for, again, maybe not everyone, but at least a subset of individuals with ADHD, there's an actual neural immaturity that may help us have some compassion as teachers and parents and advocates for understanding why some kids with this diagnosis seem to not be as literally behaviorally and emotionally mature as their peers. What causes ADHD? It's a trick question, as I just mentioned 2 slides ago. There's not one cause, but overall, if you put on a bell curve how regulated versus dysregulated in attention someone is, or their executive functions, and you do twin and adoption studies to see what causes those differences across the population, in the case of ADHD, it's 75 to 80% genes rather than environments that are responsible for these individual differences. And that's the statistic we call heritability. So bipolar disorder has a heritability of over 0.8, autism spectrum around 0.9. These three conditions are the most heritable psychiatric conditions we know. However, we can't make the mistake of thinking or believing that if heritable influences are this strong, it means that there's nothing we can do except do gene therapy or brain surgery. On the contrary, even very heritable conditions can be modified within an individual by the right environmental inputs at the right times. Other risk factors for ADHD include low birth weight, which is of course correlated with prematurity, but it's actually the weight of the child that seems to be more predictive. Ingestion of fetal alcohol, perhaps maternal ingestion during pregnancy of nicotine as well. Certain environmental toxins, either pre or postnatally. Lead is a good example. And the most recent research we have shows that it may well be that kids with a particular genetic vulnerability are the most likely to be susceptible to some of these environmental inputs. So what reveals ADHD around the world? Well, you can see it in very seriously affected preschoolers, but it's the beginning of compulsory education, kindergarten, first, second grade, where you start to see rates of diagnosis skyrocket. So the cause of ADHD, if you're almost sardonic about it, would be, well, compulsory education. We make kids go to school. That's where we see ADHD. It's not the cause per se, but it's the revealer. It's when, in most societies, kids are asked to do what the human brain was never evolved to do, sit still for long periods of time and learn to do complex things like read, that this is the revealer of the 5 to 6% of the population who's at substantially more genetic risk than the rest of the population. Let's talk about parenting for a moment. Gee, ADHD, Hinshaw says, is 80% heritable. I guess the only contribution parents make is the genes they give to their kids, not the environments they create. Well, it's not that simple. So in this kind of colorful, noisy slide, we see an x-axis and a y-axis across the history of child development and parenting research. We see that there's two fundamental dimensions. On the x or horizontal axis, some parents are very warm and responsive, and on the right and on the left, maybe the family was overcrowded, you didn't really want this kid, a lot of stress. The warmth and responsiveness is far lower. Now the other axis, the y-axis, is another dimension of demandingness, control, and limit setting. Again, some parents may be very high, families are more like boot camp, and other families, it's more like, well, I guess kids will just develop best on their own, we shouldn't interfere too much. Intriguingly, these two axes or dimensions of warmth and responsiveness versus limit setting and control really do form pretty much right angles, as indicated in this slide. There are many families who are high in warmth and responsiveness who are either high or low in demandingness and limit setting. So when you carve nature at its joints in this way, we see that families very warm and loving and responsive with also pretty strong strict limits in the house are authoritative is the term. Moving to the left, much less warmth, but still controlling would be more authoritarian, somewhat more dictatorial style. Back over to the bottom right, high warmth and responsiveness, but very low commands, if you will, and demandingness would be a permissive family. And then clearly in all relevant research, Very low warmth, very low limit setting would be an uninvolved all the way. You can see the term neglectful at the bottom lower left. Neglect is devastating to kids nutritionally, psychophysiologically, cognitively, emotionally. The question remains, is there an ideal parenting style, especially for at-risk kids, genetically at-risk kids, like those with ADHD? So we, of course, can't randomly assign kids with certain genetic configurations to reside in certain homes for 10 or 15 years. Our research group some years ago did what we thought was the next best thing. We had a group with ADHD, this is all boys back then, and a comparison group. And during our 6-week summer camps, we observe behaviors every day. And we also got really good measures of authoritative parenting, in this case through a questionnaire to the primary caregiver. So you can see of some of the 15 items here, independence encouragement, lots of love and warmth, not being afraid to set limits. These are the components of authoritative parenting. Our goal in this study across many summer camps was to predict by the end of the summer which kids would have the best social competence, would be the most liked by their peer group. Half the kids, boys in these camps, had ADHD, half comparison, all in a double-blind way. First of all, the primary caregivers, mainly mothers of the boys with ADHD, scored way lower on this authoritative parenting factor than the primary caregivers of our comparison group, and would sometimes even write in the margins of the questionnaire, warm, we haven't had a pleasant mealtime in 5 years. Limit setting, he gets so upset if we try to make him do his homework, we just give up. So these are challenging kids, often from toddlerhood and the preschool years, to raise. Nonetheless, we saw that there was as much variation in these scores of the ADHD group as there was in the comparison group. So our goal was to put in the hopper lots of different variables that might predict social competence, high peer regard after 6 weeks of getting to know kids for the first time. Overt aggression did not predict that. Covert stealing behavior did not predict that. The kid's anxious and depressed symptoms didn't predict it. The mother's report of her own authoritative, warm, and limit-setting style was the only significant predictor of how well liked her son would be after 6 weeks of a summer camp with boys he'd never met before. And going back a slide for a second, to get technical here, that prediction didn't really work in our control group, our comparison group of non-ADHD boys. There's a lot of ways for a non-ADHD boy to get popular, but there was a very strong and significant prediction within the ADHD group, suggesting to us that if a parent can maintain warmth and limit setting in the challenging situation of raising a son with ADHD, that might actually be a protective factor propelling him to social competence. Okay, skeptics out there, you're going to say, did you randomly assign kids to ADHD genes, or did you randomly assign kids to parents? Maybe there's a common set of genes that underlies both authoritative parenting and social competence in kids. Well, if you don't believe me, believe Gordon Harold, our British colleague, who with seminal publications, a couple in 2013 and one in late 2019, tried the same thing in a large set of adoption studies in the UK. So in adoption studies, there is, by definition, with early adoptive placements, no clear genetic resemblance between the raising parents, the adoptive parents, and the kid that they're raising. About 5% of these samples had ADHD. British rates of diagnosis used to be much lower. They're kind of more with the DSM standards now, about the same as the rest of the world. And intriguingly, those parents, when their kids were about in first grade, first year of primary school in the UK, who were raising kids with ADHD, had a lot of non-authoritative, more authoritarian, harsh parenting. These kids kind of elicited it. And even when you took out of the equation the early behaviors of those boys and girls who pushed their parents to this less adaptive style. That less adaptive style predicted 5 and 10 years later the continuation of those ADHD symptoms and the onset of some comorbid symptoms as well. And remember, this is in a sample in which the parents and the kids are not genetically related. So as heritable as ADHD is, child rearing still does matter. We're going to switch gears and talk for a few minutes about the understudied topic of girls and women with ADHD. I learned in grad school many decades ago that ASD, autism spectrum disorders, and ADHD, it was then called hyperkinesis or hyperactivity, really didn't exist in girls. I doubted that, and along with other, let's call ourselves pioneering investigators in the 80s and 90s, began to get a sense of what it would take. We got a large grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to begin a study having girls with ADHD, 10-hour diagnostic battery, very carefully assessed, and a matched comparison group participate in our 6-week summer programs to get all kinds of data, and then secured a series of follow-up NIH grants to follow them into mid-adolescence, late adolescence, and early adulthood. We call this study the B-GALS, the Berkeley Girls with ADHD Longitudinal Study. I thank my colleague Jim Swanson for a great acronym. So 140 girls with carefully diagnosed ADHD, 88 matched comparisons, follow-up 5, and about 6 years later, we've had very good luck and skill with getting just about all of the sample back. We take real pains to make sure that we travel to them or they travel to us, compensate them at the right rates, and they've been treated well in our programs. So a longitudinal study is, of course, really about as good as the percentage that you can retain, so you've got valid findings. Long story short, in early adolescence and then later adolescence, the academic and social and interpersonal and neuropsychological, executive functioning, all the domains we measured in childhood. We did follow-up measurements with parallel measures in adolescence and early adulthood, and the girls with ADHD remained way behind the comparison group. So the impairments were strong. We, of course, repeated many of the same measures, childhood, early to mid-adolescence, late adolescence, and in adulthood. But of course, as a sample ages, you've got to add new measures to be developmentally desensitive to the life challenges they're going through. So one set of measures we added at our third wave, average age of about 20, and our fourth wave, average age of about 26, was measurement of self-harm. So we can make a fundamental subdivision that you either have the idea of or a plan for an actual attempt at suicide. Your intention is to end your life, versus NSSI, non-suicidal self-injury, where you may do some very vicious things to your body, but your goal is to, well, that's the $64 jillion question, to relieve pain, to mask pain, to experience physically pain that you might be experiencing psychologically. But your goal is not to end your life. The goal is to get the pain out or expressed differently in some way. I hasten to add at the bottom of this slide that we shouldn't think that these are completely separate entities. In fact, a history of increasingly severe NSSI in your teen years is a potent predictor of frank suicide attempts in your 20s. We published back in 2012 our first findings about up through age. Girls were then not young women, 18 to 23, average age of about 20. If they had entered our summer programs 10 years before with the combined form of ADHD, that is, lots of impulsivity as well as inattention, there was a 23% risk of a serious suicide attempt by age 20. The purely inattentive group, 8% risk. The comparison group in the kind of tannish color, 6%. That's the national average. This isn't a highly skewed San Francisco Bay Area sample. And then for moderate to severe NSSI, not twirling your hair or picking a cuticle, cutting, burning, banging your head harshly. 51% of the combined form of ADHD, high impulsivity as well as inattention, engaging in this, just over a quarter of the inattentive, and 19% of our comparisons. Now, this is a typically developing comparison group. You could say 19% are engaging in moderate to severe NSSI. This is precisely at the national epidemiological averages. If you haven't noticed, there's an epidemic, especially in teen girls, also boys to some extent too, of non-suicidal self-injury. These findings gathered attention when we published them. The first indication in the US that early impulsivity, especially, and inattention as well, but mainly impulsivity, is driving girls more so than any boy samples that had been studied heretofore to very serious self-harm. So our attempts in the next couple of studies were to figure out why. These are called mediator analyses. At wave 1 in girlhood, our summer camps, we knew whether girls had ADHD or not, and whether they had high impulsivity or not. Over on the right, at wave 3, 10 years later, we could measure the severity of their cutting and burning behavior. And in the middle, our wave 2, when they were about 14 or 15, we measured a whole lot of variables in early to mid-adolescence. Here, what you see, and I'll have to go quickly, the mediators of this strong link between early ADHD and the severity of NSSI were first a neuropsychological test of response inhibition, the cancel underlying test. You don't have good executive functions and kind of halting that previous chain of rewarded behaviors. And the parents and teachers report of the girls acting out in aggressive behavior. So moving quickly to the next slide, it's the same setup, but you see over on the right, we're predicting now to suicide attempts, not NSSI severity. The only significant early adolescent mediator was the parents and teachers and girls' own self-report of her anxiety and depression and social withdrawal, the internalizing symptoms. So let's just go back so as not to test your working memories again. Neuropsychological dysfunction and externalizing aggressive behaviors mediate NSSI, but internalizing sad, anxious, depressed, social withdrawn behaviors are mediating suicide attempts. This is Erica Swanson's dissertation, published in 2014. Jocelyn Mesa's master's thesis took on the same paradigm, but looking at peer relationships, because we know they're compromised in kids with ADHD. Wave 1 commissions is just a dimensional way of saying it's ADHD early on. The big predictor of NSSI severity 10 years later was the girl's report in middle school of her being picked upon verbally or physically, being victimized by peers. However, the main mediator of suicide attempts was the middle school teacher's report of what percentage of the girl's classmates rejected her. So both, again, peer victimization is reported by the girl, and the teacher's report of the actual kind of throwing out of the peer group, the girl in mid-adolescence, differentially mediate NSSI versus suicide attempts. And in what we think is a kind of landmark finding, Maya Gundelman did a study with us during her graduate years where she got a team to code laboriously, painstakingly, all 228 charts of all of our participants, and the coders did not know who had ADHD and who did not. They were able to extract reliably measures of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and or neglect. Clearly, and not surprisingly, if you sum those together, we found higher rates of these maltreatment variables in our ADHD than our comparison group. But the big finding was as follows. If you take our ADHD group only, who have these high rates of risk for NSSI and suicide attempts, and you score them for both their early ADHD and the presence of either physical or sexual abuse or neglect or some combination, remember that suicide rate of 23% for the combined group early. That rate now rose to 34%. In other words, having early ADHD, largely genetically mediated symptoms, and the experience of maltreatment increased the risk of suicidal behavior by over 50%. This is very similar, intriguingly, to bipolar disorder, another highly heritable condition. But if you have bipolar disorder and you experienced early physical or sexual abuse, the suicide rate is already astronomical in bipolar disorder, but it goes up by 30–40% if you've experienced maltreatment when you're young. We're going to skip the bottom here in the interest of time. What have we found in our most recent follow-up when the young women are approaching 30? Our comparison group had an unplanned pregnancy rate of 10%. Our ADHD sample grown up had an unplanned pregnancy rate of 44%, nearly 1 in 2. Crucially, when we looked for mediators there, I don't have a chart in the interest of time, it was middle school academic disidentification and poor grades that largely explained the early ADHD, later unplanned pregnancy risk. So there's a clear area for intervention to keep girls with ADHD engaged academically as possible, especially through the trials and tribulations of middle school. We've also found in other studies that things like self-control, poor delay of gratification, think of the marshmallow test, and again, low academic achievement, are crucial to maintain good self-control, enhancing delay of gratification, and enhancing achievement if we're to help girls with ADHD thrive. Okay, we're kind of coming up to part 4 for the next 5 minutes, which is, in the United States at least, is ADHD diagnosed more than before? And the answer is clearly yes. It's been hard to know until relatively recently because we don't have the same Danish or Swedish or Norwegian population registries where everybody's assessed basically from birth and all data are combined from all social and medical service systems. But starting in the early 2000s, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention started applying the National Survey of Children's Health, random phone dial to 100,000 families around the country, and adding questions about ADD or ADHD. 2003, 2007, 2012, if you do the math, a 41% increase, and this has risen even slightly more by 2016, the most recent data, in the number of families who report that a professional has told them their son or daughter has ADHD. For the first time in 2012 and persisting to 2016-17, more Black kids are now diagnosed than white kids. More kids in poverty are being diagnosed than upper middle class kids, which is probably a truer reflection rather than the referral bias we had before. About 2/3 of kids with a diagnosis get medication. That rate hasn't increased. The rate has increased for adults, but more kids are getting medicated because more kids are getting diagnosed. So there's a bunch of reasons why such diagnoses were going up: policy shifts in the 90s, direct-to-consumer ads, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to skip over this slide in the interest of time. But what was really fascinating was not just these precipitously rising rates of prevalence, at least the diagnosed prevalence. True prevalence of ADHD is hard to know because we don't have a blood test or a brain scan at present. But what was really striking was huge state-by-state variation. The darkest colored states here are the states with rates of ADHD diagnosis that were 2.5 to 3 times those in the Great Plains, Colorado, New Mexico, California, Nevada. This is called area variation. It's been a topic in public health since the 70s with Wenberg's seminal publications. So Richard Scheffler, health economist at Berkeley, and I tried to understand not only why ADHD rates were rising so quickly in the United States, but why there's such drastic variation. Well, maybe it's that there's more Black kids in the South, North Carolina, Arkansas, the 2 highest rates out there, more Hispanic kids out west. Adjusting for demographics did nothing to change these data. Maybe because we know in cancer that there's a pretty strong correlation between the number of cancer doctors and the number of cancer patients in an area, doctors or families moving to cancer centers, et cetera. There was no such explanation for ADHD and the numbers of county by county pediatricians or child and adolescent psychiatrists. We couldn't find any cultural factors. But we did, because Professor Scheffler had heard me talk some years ago about compulsory education as being a big revealer of ADHD. And as a health economist, he said, I think of ADHD as a productivity disorder. If you have ADHD, you're not doing well in school, you're going to have lowered ceiling for what kind of jobs you can get. I wonder, and we both wondered out loud at lab meetings, whether policies about school testing would have anything to do with this. So the long story short here is that we found that from the 80s and 90s moving forward, by the late 90s, 30 states in our country had enacted what are called consequential accountability laws. Your district is rewarded if the test scores go up. These are public school districts, and punished or penalized through various means if your test scores aren't rising fast enough. ADHD had nothing to do with those laws. It was about how to get test scores to go up. Then in 2002, No Child Left Behind got passed, and at a federal level, the remaining 20 states, 21 if you include the District of Columbia, suddenly had consequential accountability because that was one of the provisions of No Child Left Behind. So if you're thinking as we were thinking, it's a natural experiment, not randomly assigned. 30 states have these laws emphasizing school testing at all costs before, and then 21 suddenly do in the early 2000s. It just so timed that the year that No Child Left Behind took place was the year of the initial National Survey of Children's Health survey that emphasized ADHD symptoms. What did we find? I'm going to have to go very quickly. The blue line rising steeply from 10% to 15.5%. These are kids at the poverty level. So we hypothesized this would apply to the poorest kids in a given state because they're the ones in Title I public schools, often in inner cities. In those states that suddenly had consequential accountability via No Child Left Behind, a nearly 60% increase in ADHD diagnoses over the next 4.5 years. The richer kids in those states, or the kids in private schools, or the kids in states that had already had those laws before, didn't show nearly such a steep increase. So this would be an unintended effect. No Child Left Behind, consequential accountability doesn't mention ADHD. It mentions you better get your district's test scores up, come hell or high water. So there must have been pressure on school administrators to get more kids, especially kids at the poverty level, diagnosed, because maybe with treatment, the kids' scores would improve. And until this became illegal in 2011, a much more nefarious interpretation is that if, as an administrator, you got a lot of kids diagnosed with ADHD quickly, well, now they're special ed kids. And guess what happens next spring? Their scores are pulled out of your school district's mean reading or math score. So it was in some ways gaming the system, diagnosing kids, vulnerable kids, in order to basically falsely raise the district's test score average. How can this happen? The American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry have published very clear evidence-based guidelines for how to diagnose and assess ADHD. But on average in our country, with general pediatricians for kids or general practitioners for adults, the average diagnosis is made in assessments that are one shot, 10 to 15 minutes. No use of rating scales, norms, no developmental history. These quick and dirty assessments can lead to a lot of overdiagnosis because a lot of things look like ADHD that aren't. But intriguingly, they can also lead to underdiagnosis because the doctor may say, well, gee, she's not fidgeting in the chair outside in the waiting room. I guess it can't be ADHD. Or her parents report that she can't stop playing video games, must not be ADHD. So we pay the price now or later. A big policy issue for me is reimbursing providers to do the evidence-based assessments that are truly needed in order to get ADHD diagnosed accurately, which could help with secondary prevention and not overdiagnosing in many ways. So we've just got a few minutes left. We really need a whole other session on treatment. The two clearly evidence-based supported treatments for ADHD are medications, often the stimulants, there's non-stimulant alternatives, or behavioral interventions, reward-based programs for kids. By the time you're a mid-teen and up to adulthood, cognitive behavioral interventions that focus on time management, organizational skills, anger control. Lots of other interventions have been tried and some studied well. Neurofeedback, initial promise. When there's controlled trials against sham or fake neurofeedback, the results are much less robust than we had hoped. Cognitive training, can you teach working memory? You can teach a kid to learn a few more digits that they can hold in their head. Doesn't seem to generalize to homework and to the playground performance the way we would have hoped. Diet, the initial dietary claims of 50 years ago were overstated. Additives are a culprit for young kids in enhancing ADHD symptoms. And in terms of exercise, aerobic exercise isn't as strong in its effects as medications or behavioral interventions, but it does show significant benefits. We need holistic treatments. We don't need just one thing at a time. THC, chiropractic, there's a lot. Go to the websites and get depressed. There's a lot of fringy treatments for ADHD that are not supported by trials at this point. Whatever treatment you use as a practitioner, you've got to monitor it. Medications require monitoring from parents and teachers a couple of times a week with rating scales. Behavioral treatments, you can't know if a kid's improving unless you collect data on the kid's home and school performance. So I'm going to have to skip over a couple of slides here and show two summary slides. If you want to decrease the symptoms of ADHD in childhood, as we did in our EPIC multimodal treatment study of ADHD, the MTA study that NIMH supported over 20 years ago, medication works quickly and best. Adding behavioral treatments doesn't make a significant increment. But if your goal, as in this slide, is to improve ADHD symptoms and aggression and depression, to improve schoolwork, peer relationships, and improve parenting practices, getting them towards a more authoritative style, it's the combination treatment, this sort of dark purple line. Lower is better, the fastest and most pronounced improvement, followed by medication only, behavioral only, and regular community care, which essentially was fairly watered down treatments. And in the final slide, remember ADHD is heritable, right? Parents have nothing to do with it. If a family in the MTA study got our combined treatment, medications plus behavioral treatments, and improved their parenting, the red line, these kids got into the normal range of function. So that's the end of this too much information into one talk. I'd like to thank my lab, all of our participants, our funders, the new Schwab Center at UCSF and Berkeley, and BBRF for supporting this webinar series. Thanks very much.
Steve, thank you for so much information. Thank you for all the work that you've done on this important area, and I appreciate it. I want to ask you one question in the time that we have left, and that question relates to the sort of the course of ADHD. There's sort of the saying that some kids grow out of it, so I'm curious about that saying. And then the other question is, in adults who get diagnosed with ADHD, is it that they just got diagnosed now, or did it really develop now, you know, and hadn't been there at an earlier age?
Well, thanks for the extra 20 minutes to take on these very important questions. So let's start with the second. There has been a lot of talk in the last 5 years about some findings from around the world that there's some people who seem to appear de novo with ADHD in their 20s or 30s, adult onset. There's been a lot of controversy, and our own lab and many others have looked carefully. The majority of so-called adult onset cases, you wake up one day with ADHD, you've had sub-threshold symptoms as a kid and teen. Maybe you had a good family life. Maybe you were smart and you really worked hard in school, and then you went to college or grad school or got a job that was challenging and all hell broke loose. Or comorbid anxiety, depression, or substance abuse kind of masked the symptoms. There are some cases we think of truly brand new ADHD in adulthood, but most often, even though it might not have been diagnosed before, you can see the trajectory that it doesn't have to appear, and this is especially true in girls, Jeff. Middle school and high school, girls are delayed in getting some of the antisocial behaviors compared to boys, and the clinicians, parents, and teachers don't really believe that girls can still have ADHD, another reason for the delay in diagnosis. Now, do I have time for the first part, or are we right at our clock?
We're gonna go over, because I personally want to hear this answer, and I know a lot of our audience does as well.
All right, so just go back to the first question, so I got it, the first part of the question, so I can get it nailed.
The first part of the question is the old saying that kids will grow out of it as they reach adulthood.
So we have just completed a study based on long-term follow-up data of hundreds of kids on this topic. Here's the issue. If you diagnose a kid carefully in childhood, and then you follow them up for 10, 20, 25 years into adulthood, most of them will not meet the very strict DSM criteria in adulthood, largely because all of us, whether we have ADHD or not, are not as physically active and fidgety and squirmy at 25 as we were at 5, right? But if you lighten up a little bit on more and use age norm symptoms, and even if you include people who may not have all 6 of the 9 inattentive symptoms or all 6 of the 9 hyperactive and impulsive, the DSM now says 5, giving a little bit of slack. But if you look at life adjustment problems, maybe 30 to 40% meet the full strict criteria for ADHD 20 years later. You say, well, ADHD goes away 2/3 of the time. But if you cut a little slack on the symptoms, given the developmental curves and trajectories, and if you count those with serious life impairments, that goes up to 2/3 or 70%. So the majority of people with ADHD continue to have residual problems, even though they technically might not be diagnosed according to the strict standards. And it's really those life impairments, rather than whether you have 5, 6, or 7 symptoms in a given domain, that tells me that we need to continue treatment.
Thank you. Very important information. And I think in addition to everything you said, just to emphasize that treatment really does make a difference, and the combination of a few different treatments really can be key to the development of a child and the continued health of an adult. So
couldn't agree more. Multimodal treatments are more, as in major depression with ADHD, the more you can get the best medication at the right dose, which doesn't happen overnight, and you can get effective behavioral and cognitive behavioral treatments, you have a much better chance of getting into the normative rate of functioning than with either treatment alone.
Good. Well, on that important and hopeful note, I'm going to say again, thank you, Steve, for all that you do, for taking the time for this outstanding presentation.
And thanks to you and to BBRF and all the attendees today.
Good, thanks. I also want to thank all of the attendees today and want to remind people that 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in our grants to scientists. All of the research we fund is made possible through supporters like you. So please consider making a gift by visiting our website, bbrfoundation.org, or calling us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it with family and friends, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. I hope you'll join us again next month when Dr. Kanaka Rajan, Assistant Professor in the Department of Neuroscience and Friedman Brain Institute at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, will present How Brain Circuits Function in Health and Disease, Understanding Brain-Wide Current Flow. This webinar will take place on Tuesday, February 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your support. Take care.